All right, hello everyone and welcome. As Gina said, I've had the pleasure of being here for the last 6-7 months now, and working on a project to catalog the museum's manuscript collection. This is probably not one of the most obvious parts of the museum, simply because it's kept in the library, but it's a very significant part. The museum has been collecting manuscripts, which are original documents from Maine's maritime past since its founding in the 1930s. And so we have, thousands of letters and diaries and logbooks and other types of material that are our original written record of what Maine's maritime past looked like. And my job here is to catalog that. I realize that cataloging can be a bit of a black box sort of word. You start and then you have a catalog record. So if we think about the challenges of cataloging manuscripts, my job is essentially to come and to describe what the museum has in its collection and to write that up so that it's possible for researchers, for staff members, for volunteers to find out what we have and to use it for research to find new stories and expand our understanding of Maine's maritime history. Describing what we have is a little bit of a challenge. And I think we can think of it, if you were going to describe what a library had and you said, well, we have 50,000 books. This book is blue, this one is green, this one is silver. Somebody would probably look at you and say, well, yeah, but what's in the books? And when we think about libraries, it's fairly easy because books have titles, books have authors, books have subject headings that are attached to them. And relatively clear what's going on. When we're talking about manuscripts, we're talking about material that was never meant to be published. It's the things that people wrote and generated through the ordinary course of life. So it doesn't have a title. It doesn't always have an author. Many people did not write their names on things, including myself, but I try to now. And it doesn't necessarily have a set of subjects. What is this about? And so that's what I'm trying to do, to figure out, what are these documents? Who wrote them? What were they doing when they wrote them? What kinds of topics can be accessed by reading the documents? And I write that up in something called a finding aid, which keeps that information in a form that's searchable online. And part of this project has been getting those finding aids online so that you can search them from anywhere and discover what we have and what you might want to find. So Gina, if you want to share the screen, I can walk you through some of the new ways we have to find manuscript collections, and then I'll follow that by exploring some of the types of documents that we have in this collection, so you can start getting some ideas. All right, so one of the ways you can start to find these documents is through our collections portal. If you go to the Maine website and click on the menu and it drops down collections, explore our collection, you'll wind up here, which is searching our past perfect database. And if you want to hone in on just what's in the archives, you can unclick all of the blue boxes over there that are not archives, and that will sort of limit your search that way. And then if you put something, you have a lot of fields you can search by. Description is probably the broadest. So if we put in description something like sardine, and hit search, the database will chew through and see what we have. And it will think about it. But so past perfect, this particular search database will search all of our archival material. And we'll also, if you wanted to, if you don't uncheck all the boxes, you'll also be able to see what we have that is a photograph or an object that is related to whatever you're searching for as well. There we go. So here we have results, and these are all collections that we have in the Penobscot Marine Museum. So if you can click on Maine Sardine Council, Gina, we'll go to the record. And so we have the title of the record up top there, types of materials it is, and then in description, there's 2 paragraphs here. Or in description, we have a description of what kinds of documents are in the collection. And that's trying to say, what are the things you will find here? Below that, we have something called an admin biographical history. And that's talks about what the entity is that created it. In this case, is the Maine Sardine Council, which was established to promote the sardine fishery. And so because it was established to promote the sardine fishery, the kinds of documents that they produced are mostly promotional, and that will help you, figure out whether or not it's what you want in looking at research. And if you scroll down a little bit farther, we see a blue link in the middle that says finding aid available here. If you click on that, it will come up with the full finding aid. What we have in Past Perfect is a summary. The full finding aid, if you scroll through, it has some boilerplate language up front. And then we get the same kinds of things. We have a brief description up top, so you can see quickly if this is something you're interested in. Subject headings, keep going. Related materials, so if you're interested in this, but maybe something a little different, that'll tell you what's there. Historical note and scope and content, the same two fields, who made this and what is it? And then at the bottom, we have something called the box and folder list. And this is the folder by folder listing of what is actually in the collection. So if you're interested in something, but not sure if it's there, you can read through this and find out. You can also then, when you come to visit the library, zero in on what you're most interested in relatively quickly and maximize your time while here. All right, thank you. So another way we can search for manuscripts is through the Maine InfoNet Library System, or MILS. This is also linked through the Penobscot Marine Museum's page. And it has a similar search engine, but it pulls from slightly different fields. So sometimes if you don't find something in Past Perfect, you can come over to MILS and it will show up for you. So Gina, if you put in lobster boat, and instead of view entire collection, put in Penobscot Marine Museum. Submit. And anything with the little yellow box over there is going to be our archival material. And the same thing happens. You can click on the link in the title. And you get a description of what the collection is. And in the middle, there's a link to the finding aid. So same thing, help you see what you've got. And the third way of accessing our archives, which is pretty exciting, is that they're starting to pop up now in Google results. So if you're Googling somebody specific related to Maine's maritime history, you might actually find us. So in this case, if we put in J.H. Lane, Searsport, Maine, with Google, it helps be specific because they're searching so many things. Maine. Don't you notice that right there at the top of the page, we have a link to the Brig J.H. Lane papers. And sure enough, here we are again at our own finding aids. So you may see this in the future, and it's certainly very exciting to us to have this showing up in something like Google. All right, so that concludes the bit about how to find these things. And now I'm going to talk a bit about what we actually have in the archives and what the exciting things are that I found in my time here. And I'm going to talk both about what's in the documents and about the kinds of documents themselves, because doing archival research often requires a bit of creativity in terms of what you think you want to look at. If you have a research question, just start thinking through, who might be involved, but also what kinds of papers might be generated, and why might people be writing things down. But I'll start with the easiest, which is the people who wanted to write things down, people who are keeping diaries and letters, especially while at sea. So I share screen. Let's start with this diary, which, as we can see, does not actually originate from Searsport. It's called the Queensland Exercise Book. So this book was purchased in Australia in the 1890s. It was written in by Alice G. Drinkwater, who was from Yarmouth, Maine. She was a sea captain's wife, and she sailed with her husband several times around the world. In this case, she's been very kind to us. She's titled it A Journal of a Voyage from New York to Brisbane, Australia, and given us a date of 1898. And this is one of those great journals that sort of tells you exactly what you want to know if you want to know a little bit about life at sea. We start out, saying we left New York, okay, January 26th, for 4 days had heavy northwest gales and high seas, which broke on board continuously. One found its way into the cabin by forcing open the pilot house door. Sorry, make the thing focus. All right. And then she says, I escaped getting wet, however, as I was in my berth at the time, where I spent most of the 4 days. So she's not saying everything, but she's seasick. This is not a comfortable start to a voyage to Australia. Her next line is also interesting. It says, oil was used more or less during the time. And what she means is that they're spreading oil on the sea to help calm the waves right close to the ship. which is something that was often done in very rough weather, although it's not clear to me if the weather was very rough or if her husband was a little worried about his wife being seasick in her berth for 4 days. Either way, they were using oil. Eventually, the weather clears up. We carry on down the page. Fine weather, south and southwest winds, and warm and nice. Have spent much time on deck. Have done some sewing and more reading. Have practiced some with the camera. Have finished some pictures with very good results. So talking about what you do at sea, and in 1898, she had a camera and she was developing film on board, which is pretty cool to think about. We don't have her photos here at the Maine Maritime, Penobscot Marine Museum, but we do have some photographs by other women who were at sea and taking photos as well. So diaries are really wonderful sources. They tell you a lot about the people who were writing them. They tell you a lot about the people that they were interacting with and the kinds of things they were doing. The limits on diaries, and the reason why I get to write about a scope and content, what's actually in this diary, is that the diary is often limited by the interests of the person who's keeping it. So Alice Drinkwater was a pretty good diarist in that she wrote a lot down of what was happening. My next diary, which I do appreciate very much, also nicely labeled, kept by Margaret M. Oakes, who was from Brewer, Maine. She was the granddaughter of a shipbuilder, Joseph Oakes, and the daughter of a sea captain, George H. Oakes. And when she was 14, her father took her to sea on a rare occasion. They didn't travel usually with him, but he took her to sea on a voyage to Marseille, France. And so she's 14, she's at sea. She's been hearing about the sea, certainly from her family, a long time. And she starts out her diary not at all like we'd expect a girl to be writing a diary. She starts it out by saying, Monday, September 27th, took tug Gracie this morning at 10 o'clock and passed Hellgate for Marseille, France. The chock that held the tug's hawser between it, fastened to it, gave way with part of the rail. Maritime accident, but minor. At 12, the tug and pilot left. At 7 in the evening, we ran into a fog bank, tacked ship and stood back until morning. It tells you a lot about what's going on the boat. It also sounds almost exactly like a sea captain writing a journal, or someone who'd be expecting a career at sea. And so I appreciate this because we often expect 19th century women to be preoccupied with things that are stereotypically 19th century and women's work. And here's a 14-year-old who's absolutely delighted to be at sea, and she is picking up all of the language from her father and from the ship that she can. And she continues on throughout the diary. It's mostly focused on what the ship is doing, what the sailing conditions are, etc. At least until she gets to Marseille, in which time she turns into a pretty good travel diarist as we go. But anyway, that is Margaret M. Oakes' diary, and it is a pretty wonderful thing. So another type of manuscript that gets used a lot in conjunction with diary is the word logbook. And this isn't helped by the fact that a lot of 19th century diarists, especially those going to sea, titled their diaries logs. We have a lot of logbooks at the Penobscot Marine Museum. However, a lot of them, most of them, are not at all like diaries at all. And that's because the log was an official record of the ship's voyage. And if you got into trouble, having a logbook that was properly filled out was a good way to show that you'd made all of the necessary efforts to keep a disaster from happening. So when you talk about logbooks, the formal definition of a logbook is this formal record of the ship's voyage. And I should mention before I go further, you'll notice that I'm handling archival documents and I'm doing it without gloves on. This is a conservation decision that's been made by the museum. Gloves help protect our objects from the oils in our hands, which is really important when you're working with things that are made out of metal or other surfaces that are liable to degrade. In the case of paper, because paper tends to be so fragile, it's a trade-off. It's not as damaged by the oils in our hands as we are likely to tear it. And so that's why the museum and many places have made the decision not to use white gloves. But it is something you should ask if you're ever in a special collected archive, what the institution chooses to do. So anyway, carrying on to the logbook. So here we have, speaking to the ubiquity of these things, this is a pre-printed front page. Logbook, Voyages of the Brig Abbey Clifford, commanded by E.W. Clifford. And in this case, this vessel was in fact named for the captain's wife. Edwin W. Clifford was from Stockton, Maine, which is where the Abbey Clifford was built. His wife was named Abby, and she accompanied him on a number of voyages, including, as it will turn out, this one. But a logbook, we take a look at what the logbook is. We find that it is, in fact, a pre-printed form. It tells you where you've been, where you're going. It has a number of columns you want to come in. Hours, the time that the record is being made. K stands for knots, which is the speed of the ship. F can be for the force of the wind, although obviously Captain Clifford or his mate didn't think it was very necessary to fill this out. Course is the direction that the ship is steering. So when you go to plot it on a chart, you have this record of which way you're pointed. Winds, what direction the winds are. Leeway, what direction you're drifting, because sailing ships can't sail a straight line in the wind. They do drift a little bit downwind as they're being forced that way. If you're a scientific captain or mate, you can record the water temperature, the air temperature, and the atmospheric pressure. But in this case, folks on the Abbey Clifford weren't doing that. And then you have remarks. And unlike a diary, remarks, or perhaps very like a diary, remarks are very much a matter-of-fact statement of what's happening on the ship. So on Wednesday, the 13th of December, 1871, the first part, moderate winds. Okay, so they're sailing along just fine. Middle part, fresh breeze. I'm picking up a bit. Latter, moderate. And then they exchanged latitude with an English bark bound north. So double checking where their position was, 42 days out from port. And the bottom line on each day of entry is a place to write your navigation, what your course has been, how far you've sailed, so very basic plotting on a chart, how many degrees of latitude you've sailed across the day, your departure, how many degrees of longitude, latitude by dead reckoning, so doing some basic geometry and figuring out where you think you are, latitude by observation, so taking a sight with the sun and figuring out where the atmosphere says you are, variation in your compass, which is important, diff of longitude, again, how far you've sailed, longitude by your instruments, your chronometer, and longitude by observation. So many different ways of pinpointing your position on the chart. And again, important because if you happen to run aground, it helps be able to say, well, I thought I knew where I was, or something along those lines. So logbooks are also kept in port, although slightly different emphasis. This we see, they've sailed to Rio de Janeiro and then up to Pernambuco, Brazil to load some sugar. And instead of having all of this navigation in port, they just need to record what's going on. So weather, fresh breezes, went into the river harbor and moored, commenced to discharge ballast the next day at night seeing. And so it goes on for about a week and a half, all is well. They're discharging, they have lighters. This is often a good place to find little notes about how the ship interacted with people on shore, what was going on with the sailors, small notes on that nature. So all goes well until we get to this day, Saturday, the 16th of December, of March, sorry, Saturday, the 16th of March. First part's rainy, latter part's clear, the cook goes to the hospital. They don't say with what, but the cook is in the hospital. Next day is rainy. The day after that, they send one man to the hospital. The day after that, they send the second mate to the hospital. So something is going through the crew. They're not writing what exactly, but something is going through the crew. The day after that, we send another man to the hospital and we get news that the cook has died. A couple days later, we get the second mate back. Whoops. On a bit of a rainy day after we've loaded a bunch of bags of sugar. So obviously Captain Clifford didn't like this situation very much, so he opted to get to sea as quickly as possible, which was perhaps a good decision. It seems like they were coming down, as far as we can tell, likely with yellow fever or some kind of mosquito-borne illness. Unfortunately, they took the illness with them. So here we have the 30th of March, standard logbook entries again, moderate breeze. 2 men are sick, but the pumps are carefully attended. So when the sugar cargo gets to New York, they can say we pumped out the salt water as fast as it came in. The cargo should not be damaged. We made all of our efforts to make sure that the cargo was not damaged. The next day is calm, and here we are, the captain and wife are very sick. 2 men are sick. So this keeps going. The captain and wife are still sick. Pumps are carefully attended. One man is sick. And we keep going for a couple more days along these lines until we get to the 5th of April, when we see that the captain was very sick. At 8 p.m., he lost his reason, continued a little bit longer until 5:45 in the morning, when he died having the black vomit for 9.5 hours. At 6 a.m., we buried him and set colors at half-mast. So this is not great for your voyage. Fortunately, the logbook, and it appears a lot of the navigation, we see these numbers still, are being done by the first mate. So the ship can still carry on without the captain. Mrs. C is some better. So captain's wife is getting over this, and another passenger is still sick. The next day, however, the writing changes, which is not a good sign. These 24 hours commence with light winds. The mate is taken sick. So the logbook is often kept by the first mate of the ship. The second mate was a step down in the hierarchy, is often your first step into the world of navigating and being responsible for a ship. So this second mate, the first time probably actually keeping the logbook, the mate is taken sick, and he's taken sick, and the second mate is suddenly in charge. And we can see that at the very bottom here. Suddenly a lot of these boxes that are navigation are no longer filled out. So potentially not a great sign. Turn the page. The mate is doing his best. The second mate is doing his best. Folks are still sick. Here we go. At 1 p.m., we saw a ship to leeward. At 4 p.m., we took in the mainsail, et cetera, et cetera. We spoke to the ship and asked for assistance, but could not procure any. The ship was bound from Montevideo towards Cuba. So the second mate is realizing that the number of sick folks on the ship is overwhelming him, and he doesn't really know what he's doing. So we still don't have a lot of navigational works. But nobody wants to talk to him. So all continues the next day and carry on. But nobody will help them, and nobody knows how to navigate. They're really drifting here and asking for help. But this changes on Wednesday, April 1st. The captain's wife has gotten better, and at some point in the afternoon, she takes things in hand. So we have this 2 notes in the logbook on April 5th. At 3:30 a.m., the mate died and buried him, but the ship is now being navigated by the captain's wife. At 6 p.m., they set the gaff topsail, and the pumps are still being carefully attended to. And this is where this voyage starts turning around. The captain's wife, she takes a couple days to get better, but in not too long, she is indeed doing all of the navigation, making the calculations. The log returns to its normal, fairly basic description of what's going on. And in due time, they wind up in New York, which is where they were supposed to go, not the nearest point of land, but they get to where they're going. Right home, another captain gets dispatched, and Mrs. Clifford goes and lives the rest of her life on shore. But this is a great example, I think, both of the limitations of a logbook, but a logbook that contains a very interesting story in the way that it is put together. All right. So diaries, logbooks, and letters are the most common descriptive items in the archives. The ones that are going to sit down and tell a story, whether it's an official story or an unofficial story from the perspective of a writer. It's not the only thing we have, and it's not the only way to tease out information about the past. Another great way to do that is through accounts, which make up a huge proportion of what we have. And that's because, whenever money is involved, particularly when money is involved across oceans, people tend to want to know where it goes. And this has not changed. It is still going on. So we see accounts for all sorts of tiny things that we might not otherwise have records of. In this case, we have loose accounts. They're often titled disbursements. These are disbursements from the Schooner Challenge in 1868, 1867, and 68. The Schooner Challenge was built in Maine. Her captain was Gamaliel Pendleton from Islesboro, island of Islesboro. And you have a number of bills. So this one, Boston, May 1858. What sorts of things do you need to spend money on? Well, food is one of them. Flour, butter, beans, potatoes, oolong tea. Anything you might want to eat is going to have money spent, and that's going to get recorded for the ship's stores. Also need to spend money on ship repairs. So we have here bits of the rigging, thimbles, jib hanks, fair leads, sail needles, kinds of things that you need to repair a ship and keep it going. Sometimes you also see bills for more extensive repairs, which is what we have here. Schooner Challenge and owners is being billed for 15 hours of carpenter's work and 4 hours of work by a caulker and brewer. So probably some of the more extensive routine maintenance that has to happen on a regular basis if you're operating a wooden ship. Accounts might not be the place to look for marine disasters, but it is often where you'll find them. This is a charge from a notary public in Edgertown, Massachusetts. He's noting a protest, which is what you have to file whenever something goes wrong with your ship, something that's going to cost the owner's money at the end of the voyage. And the early articulation of this is really great. The master of the ship is protesting against the wind and the waves and the weather, that he had done nothing wrong in wrecking this cargo. So in this case, a protest means that something went wrong. And looking at other records, we can see that they actually ran aground on Cape Cod, which is not great. They protested, they had a survey, surveyors billed, and they were able to carry on to their destination. But a little bit of money was lost, so a bill was made of that. Also get bills for things like this, procuring freight from Wilmington, North Carolina to Boston. So they're paying somebody a fee to find a cargo for the ship, to find the next bit of business. That's what's going on. You have services for making the ship's business run. This is 2 days of lightering coal, excuse the spelling, but hiring a small boat to take the cargo from the ship to shore. If you couldn't get a spot at the dock, you would be lightering. So services like this get recorded. Often a lot of people who in the maritime world don't write a lot of documents on their own account, like a lighter owner, will get recorded in a bigger ship's business. We also have pilotage. Schooner Challenge, pilotage from the river, from the ocean to Wilmington, North Carolina. And last, we get official documents, customs clearances, paying customs fees, import duties, whatever port fees might need to be paid. And in the case of a schooner running coastally, running to North Carolina in the 1850s, you also have documents like this one, which reads, "This is to certify that the schooner called the Challenge, of which Pendleton is master, leaving the Cape Fear River by the main bar, in charge of a pilot, has this day been duly visited, searched, and fumigated by me, according to the ordinances of the Commission of Navigation and Pilotage for the Cape Fear River, in such cases made and provided." So this is a lot of language to say the ship has been visited, searched, and fumigated, trying to make sure that a specific kind of nothing leaves Wilmington, North Carolina. And the issue in this case in the 1850s was slaves. The maritime world was a very porous place. There were people of all colors as part of ships' crews. There were ships that were sailing from slave-owning states to free countries. And a lot of people took the opportunity to escape from slavery using the sea. And so port towns, especially port towns in the American South, started passing these ordinances that if you were leaving to a northern port, you had to be searched, your ship had to be searched. And in some cases like Wilmington, it was going to be fumigated to make sure that nobody was hiding out down below. So not too pleasant, but if you were doing business, this was a reality of life for all Maine captains in the 1850s up until the Civil War. So a lot of different threads of history show up in accounts, in documents that might otherwise seem pretty unremarkable. And with the right amount of effort, I think there's a lot of stories to be said there. So another kind of account that captains often kept, although it wasn't as necessary because it didn't get back to the owners of a ship, was something called a slop account. And a slop account was accounts with the sailors of the ship. And sailors didn't always set off with everything they were going to need for the voyage, especially if they didn't realize they were setting off for the voyage because they were so drunk when they were brought aboard that they weren't able to pack. And so the slop chest on board was a place where sailors could resupply during the trip and also balance out their wages. So slop accounts are pretty common, especially for long distance deep sea voyages. This one is from the ship Great Admiral, which was bound from Cardiff to Cardiff to Hong Kong in the care of Captain Tobias O. Thompson of Winterport, Maine. And here we have the account with Mr. Carl Svensson. He is an able-bodied seaman. He doesn't ask for all that much. He has wages advanced to him in Cardiff, so he can buy supplies ahead of time. And all he needs is a bit of tobacco, an oilcloth jacket, some rubber boots, straw hat. Pretty reasonable things to ask for on a 4-month-long voyage. And at the end of things in July, in May, so they're still in Hong Kong, he gets paid off. His wages, $61.34. He signs his name at the bottom. A surprising number of sailors are literate, and you can see that in these kinds of accounts. And the account is settled. Same is not true for Mr. Swenson's shipmate, Hiram Wills, I think, although the name is a little unclear. Mr. Wills has to ask for a bit more oil pants, more rubber boots, dungarees, tobacco, a sheath knife, basics that you're going to want if you're at sea. He racks up charges that are within $5 of the amount he will actually be owed at the end of the voyage. And this gets subtracted. You don't get free stuff by signing on a ship. You have to, you're taken out of your wages at the end. So the bottom in pencil here, we have a note that Mr. Wills deserted on May 18th. So he does not get paid his salary, but he did get paid $62 worth of goods, advance and goods from the ship's slop chest against a total income of $65. So even though he runs from the ship and he decides he's not going to stick around, he comes off pretty well in the end. And so these slop account books are a great way to get at the sailors who are sailing on Maine ships, many of them not from Maine, many of them not leaving a written record in their own hands, but we can see some of the ways that they were interacting with this market and maritime world and making decisions about their finances for the future. All right. So my last plug for using account books to find out things you might not otherwise find is that account books, again, because money is involved, it's one of the places where things get written down that are never otherwise going to get written down. And a big one for that, for coastal Maine, is fishermen, especially not fishermen who are owning large vessels out on multi-month voyages that have to get financed, but fishermen, inshore fishermen, herring fishermen, clammers that might use their own boats, that use their own material, that aren't operating in debt, but are very active along the coasts. They don't have to write things down, and they often don't. So where we find records of them are where we find records of salt. Salt was imported to Maine, usually from Europe or the West Indies. It was imported, it had to go through the customs house, and it had to be bought and sold. So actually some of our biggest collections related to fisheries are part of the US Customs House records that we have here. Because salt was coming in, it was being imported by fishing firms, and it was being taken out of customs custody by fishing firms. And we can see those records. This here is another wonderful little book that we found. See, it's very tiny, and it's titled Clams and Pogies. So they're not high on the hierarchy of things you fish for, but very common in the coast of Maine. And it's from a firm in Brooklyn that's selling salt. And here we have all of the names of the fishermen in Brooklyn who are buying salt, which is nice. We don't normally get to see these guys in the historical record, especially because once you come around to 1871, notice that most of these guys are named things like Seth and David, but here's somebody by the name of Martha Gray, and she shows up again. Martha Gray is buying a bushel and 3/8 of salt. So this was a point where Sipperley and I got to say, you know, what's going on here? Who is Martha Gray? And it turns out she was a fisherman. She was a clammer. She was a single woman. She was living with her family. Her father died in 1869. And in the 1870 census, she went and listed her occupation as a clammer. And here she is a year later, evidently, you know, certainly keeping up with the men in the area, supporting herself by fisheries. And it's nothing that get written down. That's the only record we have of her. But we know, in a sense, that women were active in the fisheries in a way that we might not otherwise know, simply because she had to buy salt. So my last document is not going to fall in the big categories of accounts and narrative documents. It falls in the category of other, I would say. And other is the vast number of things that got written down before you had the internet, certainly, and before you had an extensive printing press and cheap way to distribute information. And so people who are going to be entering the maritime business, particularly those who had to be educated to learn navigation and to learn the intricacies of trade, often wrote down their own textbooks, if you will, often very beautifully. So this one, the covers had a bit of a rough life, but it's bound in a very nice glazed satin. And if we open the page, what we find is titled The Memorandum of Eastern Markets. So this is a person who didn't put his name anywhere in the book, as much as I wish he did. He was at sea on a ship that was bound to China and other ports in the Far East in the 1830s. We know that because the first half of the book he used as sort of a brief account, but not the kind of thing you take as a captain. What he's done here in this Memorandum of Eastern Markets is written down for future reference everything you would need to know in order to trade. So here we start with Batavia on the island of Java. Where it is, it's situated on the north side of the island. It's subject to the laws and regulations of the government of the Netherlands. Other ports that have the same regulations in case you happen to call it them. And then we get down to the nuts and bolts, so harbor regulations. Notice he's writing not like we've seen hastily, but in a very neat hand here. So all vessels coming into Batavia, all vessels coming into the port shall show this flag previous to coming in, show their flag previous to coming to anchor. So let folks know who you are. Square rig vessels have specific things they need to do. The harbor master or officer acting as such will send on board every vessel the following requests or questions for answering. So what is your flag? Where are you from? What's the name of the vessel? Who is the captain? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it actually goes on for several pages and all of the things you're going to need to do before you can actually set a foot ashore in Batavia. And if we skip ahead, let's go to Singapore instead. We get slightly fewer harbor regulations. We get a description. This port is situated on the island of Singapore. It's at the center of an immense native trade from China, Cochin China, Siam, and the islands of the Eastern Archipelago and the Straits of Malacca is increasing very fast. So for future reference for this guy, Singapore is a place you might want to develop a cargo for in the future because more and more people are trading here. This port is perfectly free. There being no import duties, no export duties, or port charges. So the section on what you have to do to trade there is much shorter. However, we keep going. The currency of Singapore is dollars and cents. That's handy. But the weights, we have pickets and caddies. The picket is 100 caddy or 133 1/3 English pounds. So, remember that 133 1/3, except for rice and salt, which are sold by Cayennes, and gold dust, which is sold by the Bunkel. The things you might need to know all over the world as you're interacting with cultures that have developed different systems of weights and measure, it's helpful to know what you're dealing with as you're trying to negotiate your cargo in foreign ports. Then we get notes on what will sell. American drillings, I think we're talking about a kind of textile here. They're the most saleable. Our sheetings, so like very basic textiles, they don't seem to take. So, don't load up a cargo of bedsheet material and expect to sell it. Bedsheet material that would probably be made by cotton grown in the American South and shipped up to northern mills. Other things you can almost always sell: sperm candles, brown soap, raisins, etc. So if you're looking at a voyage to Singapore, what are the sorts of things you might want to carry there to make a good deal? And he carries on. What will you get in Singapore? Trade of Singapore is divided into two seasons, the Bugis and the Junk season. Bugis season is when the Bugis traders arrive from the Eastern Archipelago. So he's talking about native boats following the seasonal monsoon patterns and bringing in specific stores that you can trade. So in this case, pepper, green coffee, tortoise shells, different medicines, etc., that you'll find in the season from August to November. The other half of the year is called the junk season. It's when you get junks, again, native craft, coming from China, Cochin China, Chinese, coming from the north and east, bringing sugar and rice. So if you're in the other half of the year, you're going to find those cargoes are more common in Singapore. So what interests me, many things interest me about this, but one of the things that interests me most is this articulation of the way that Maine traders and Maine sea captains, Maine merchants were interfacing with local trade patterns all over the world and had to know about the monsoons, not just to sail with them, but had to know when seasonality of cargoes in different parts of the world in order to be successful businessmen. And that's what we see written out in this crib sheet, in this record of how to trade in the Far East that was written in the 1830s. Not the sort of thing you see a lot of in collections, but the sort of thing that can be very interesting when we do find them. So with that, I think I will close and open it up for questions if there are any. And thank you all for listening.
Doesn't look like we have any questions quite yet, but if anyone has a question, you can go ahead and type it into the chat box. Sarah says this was absolutely fascinating, and I agree. This is great. Ooh, here's a good one. How do we get in touch with the archives?
Yeah, that is a great question. You can set up a research appointment if there's something you'd like to see. The email address is libraryresearcher@pmmmaine.org. And if you go to any of our finding aids, all of that contact information is on the front sheet. It's also on the library website. So. And please do, there we go. The information is also in the chat, so you can find it there.
And I'm going to put links to what we talked about earlier. So can you talk a little bit about how these records are stored?
Yeah. So they're stored in our climate-controlled archives. They're stored in acid-free materials. So a lot of paper is processed with acid in it, and that over time starts degrading the fibers of the paper and anything it touches. So when we store it in our acid-free materials, we're preventing that, keeping them stable for the long term, and they will last a long, long time. They're kept in acid-free boxes as well to protect them from elements, dust, bugs, and weather, and yeah, kept as safe as possible. And so you make a research appointment. We will ask you to have a question or have a topic, or if you want to do the research ahead of time to find out what we have, to come with a list of things you're interested in seeing, because we'll have to get them from the closed stacks and bring them out to the reading room to be used. Just because these are one of a kind. They are very old, they are fragile, and we want them to be used, but we want them to be around in the future.
Do any other resources come to mind to find regular fishermen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is the yawning gap in the written record, I think. But Penobscot Marine Museum actually has one of the best fishing collections I've seen. For early period fishermen up to the 1860s, anyone involved in the cod fishing industry was eligible for a federal bounty to encourage that fishery. And so we do have logbooks from the fishery that list, everybody's name, how many fish they caught that day, and that sort of detail. After the cod fishing bounties went away, there's a lot fewer references. And so it takes that creativity. I look at the salt records, looking at, I don't know that we have any chandlery records, but the people that would be supplying fishermen. We have some lobstering account books, a lobster buyer in Rockland, so we do have some sense of the people he's working with, and a couple documents from fishermen themselves. But for the most part, it takes that creativity to think through where things might be. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And there's a couple of questions about plans to digitize. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. In an ideal world, absolutely. In the real world, the problem with archives is that there's many, many, many pages. And to piece together a story, you often need to look at many pages and many pages in order. So for our initial process here, our effort is to do that work of, what do we have, define what we have, and get the finding aids online so that you can search for them. And then in the longer term, as funding and infrastructure becomes available, I think it's absolutely a hope that we can do this. But for the meantime, getting that first handle and getting that online is where we're looking.
Thanks. And there was a question about COVID protocols, and I would say that our best bet at this time, things are changing so quickly, would be to email before you plan to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if you email before you plan to come, our reference volunteers or reference team can sort of think about your question also, and potentially come up with materials you might not have found before.
Ooh, this is a good one. I don't know if you can answer this one. What kind of volunteer opportunities exist now that COVID restrictions are easing up?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to divert that one to our curator, Sipperly Good, who is on this call. So I don't know if you want to pin her, Gina, so she can answer, but yeah.
So I think definitely we're opening up to have to have volunteers come. And so Gina, I guess I can put my email address in the chat, and let's start a conversation. And there might be possibilities for remote volunteer opportunities, but definitely some in-house opportunities also. The building, we're sort of in a large building, so we can sequester people in nooks and crannies with a computer and definitely get people on campus.
Yeah, volunteers are a great help in this work because there's a lot of processing involved. The end product looks simple, but it's a lot of processing. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is great. So Sipperly's email's in the chat, and I encourage you to reach out to her and hook this up because we have some really cool stuff and there's great opportunities here. Oh, okay. Did you come across any stories of someone shipwrecked?
Yes. Can I remember where they are off the top of my head? Is a different question, but the one I put hands on most recently, I'm not sure if it counts as a shipwreck. It was another ship's crew that got sick, and they were saved from shipwrecks. Eventually, everyone was so sick that they essentially lashed the helm and drifted, and they wound up getting towed into New Orleans by somebody that found this drifting vessel with a lot of very sick people on board. So not quite a shipwreck, but not the kind of maritime adventure you really want. And somebody got salvage rights. So yeah.
Wow. These are all really cool stories. So what is your favorite item that you've came across during your time here so far?
Oh gosh. How to pick a favorite item? It's complicated. I think it depends on what I'm thinking. And a lot of time, the last thing I've touched is the most cool thing ever. So today I was wrapping up a collection from Margaret Oakes, the diary I talked about earlier. Her grandfather, Joseph Oakes, ran a shipyard in Brewer. And his account books aren't just, the materials used, but who was working, how many hours, which projects, how they were getting paid. He did a lot of repair work in the river. So the part of me that's an archivist and sees a lot of maritime documents says, this doesn't exist anywhere. That's awesome. So I love that. And I really, anything that tells a little bit about the world that we don't get to think about. I really love Margaret Oakes' diary, not because it's a great description of life at sea, but because it's a great description of a 14-year-old girl who wanted to be a sailor at some level. And, I sympathize with that. So I think it's great that she was able to write a diary that sounded pretty much spot on for what a captain would have written. Yeah.
So one of the challenges to dealing with these historic documents is they are written in cursive, and not everybody was the best handwriting. So what is the hardest item to decipher that you've come across?
I think the biggest challenge to deciphering is usually, I guess I've gotten pretty good at handwriting over time, but when there's surface damage to a document, so part of the word is missing or it's faded or something, that can be really difficult to read. I don't know. Handwriting gets better across the 19th century too. You know, public education made a difference. But we do find some pretty difficult ones. I think it also depends what information you're trying to get out of a document. So this guy, which I don't think I shared with you before, you know, if I had to say who was signing this note, I'm not sure I could tell you. And so a lot of times that takes triangulation with, you know, who is written in these documents with better handwriting. Are there any places that they've written their name better? Can I guess what the word might be? In this case, I'm pretty sure it's somebody's signature. And a lot of time it's sort of filling in the blank, like this word here, based on the rest of the note, I'm pretty certain it means earnings, but if I had to take that word alone, I'm not sure it would have gotten there. So yeah, deciphering its handwriting, it's the quality of the document, and then it's kind of a game to get around, you know, what the problems are and where you can go to find the answers for what's been written.
So do you think that's Merrithew?
I wonder. A schooner, so the captain was from Islesboro, it could be a Merrithew. This is, he's received of R. Pendleton, or actually that does say R, I sort of assumed it was G. So he's received of the person who owns the ship probably, as the earnings of the schooner challenge, $50 in Searsport. Actually, yeah, Searsport might be Merrithew. So what this is, somebody who owns a share of the vessel is getting their share of the earnings. And yeah, we know that the Merrithews owned a lot of vessels, and it certainly could be. Good spot.
Well, it looks like the questions are ending. This was really fun, and I'm definitely gonna touch base with you to do more of this type of stuff because it's really cool to just see like, what are you working on in this moment?
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing all of this with us, and thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you at the museum sometime.
Absolutely, and come and visit the archives too. We are here for the researchers and the public. So, yeah.
And we will be opening up more in the coming months.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night.